I woke up that morning ready to get married. Mark and I had already signed our marriage papers. All that was left was to finish the ceremony and file them. I had my dress, my vows, my future planned. And then, as I started walking down the aisle, Mark walked away. Gasps filled the room. My father, who had just been about to give me away, froze beside me. The officiant stammered, unsure of what to do. Guests whispered in shock as Mark hurried toward the exit, phone in hand. I barely registered my mother's voice behind me, panicked and confused. "Mark, where are you going?" "I'm sorry, it's an emergency. I'll catch you up later," he replied, and left. It was Hannah. I knew it before I even saw him answer his phone, before I heard him murmur her name. Before he rushed out of the church like this, our wedding was just a minor inconvenience. I stood there, frozen. A few minutes later, the best man ran after him and returned pale-faced. "She's at the airport," he muttered. "She's flying out of the country." She called him crying, saying she needed him right now. Right now, as I was walking down the aisle to marry him. That was the final straw. For years, Hannah had been a wedge between us, manipulating Mark in ways he refused to see. Just last week, she had fainted in the middle of our pre-wedding photo shoot, forcing Mark to leave me behind so he could take care of her. Months before that, she had accused me of hitting her, resulting in Mark shoving me back and running to her defense while I stood alone in the rain. And he always had an excuse. He had to check on her. He had to make sure she was okay. He owed her that much. I wasn't stupid. His friends had told me the truth, how Mark had loved her for years, right up until she married someone else. Only then did he meet me. But when she heard he was engaged, she got divorced and came running back, doing everything she could to steal his attention. And now he walked out of our wedding. And I didn't cry. I turned, walked to the signing table, and picked up our marriage papers. Then, with the entire room watching, I ripped them in half. "I guess we won't need these," I said coldly before walking out. Half the guests sided with Mark, saying Hannah was his best friend. The other half, my family and close friends, stood by me, saying I should be more important than her. The night ended in disappointment for everyone, but it wasn't over yet. That evening, Mark called from a hotel by the airport, an hour away. His voice was calm, as if he hadn't just abandoned me at the altar. "Hannah postponed her trip," he said, like he expected me to be grateful. "She'll leave after our honeymoon. She's coming with us, so you should bring Jamie too. It'll be fun." I almost laughed. While he was talking, I realized something. I was surprised that none of his friends had called him yet to tell him what I had done, to tell him I had ripped up our marriage papers. They would have called him. They should have called him. Unless Hannah had made sure he wasn't answering anyone's calls. I could already imagine it, her clinging to him, convincing him to keep his phone off or ignore any calls that weren't from her. Because if he talked to the wrong person, if he heard the wrong thing, he might second-guess what he had done, and she couldn't have that. Before I could respond, I heard Hannah's voice in the background, sickly sweet. "I'm so sorry," she cooed. "I never meant to ruin your wedding. I just wanted to see Mark one last time before he got married." I clenched my teeth as she continued. "But don't worry, I'll make sure your honeymoon is perfect." I agreed. But I didn't tell Mark I had already ripped our marriage papers to shreds. And I had no intention of going on that honeymoon at all. 2 days later, Jamie and I met Mark and Hannah at the airport. Hannah was clinging to his arm, her voice high and soft as she whined about how scared she was of flying. Mark had gone to grab food, leaving me alone with her. And then, right on cue, she turned to me, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I just don't understand why you won't forgive me," she murmured. I said nothing. Hannah sighed dramatically, just as Mark returned. He took one look at her sad expression and turned to me with irritation. "Really? You're still holding a grudge?" She apologized. I met his gaze. "And?" He scoffed, "And maybe if you weren't so petty, we could move on." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Then as the plane started boarding, I told Mark and Hannah to go ahead. I just needed to use the bathroom real quick. Jamie followed me. Instead of going to the bathroom, we headed straight to another gate. As their plane prepared for takeoff, I got a text from Mark. "Mark, where are you?" "Still in line for the bathroom." His next text came quickly, this time laced with irritation. "You're doing this because you're petty about Hannah, aren't you? If you miss this flight, I'm not paying for another ticket. You'll have to get your own flight and meet us there. Okay, then Jamie and I boarded our own flight to Thailand. The moment Mark landed and realized I wasn't coming, the texts and calls started. At first, they were laced with irritation. This is childish. You're jealous, and I'm done with it. The flight's landed, and I'm not waiting for you at the airport. Find your own way to the hotel. I didn't respond. Half a day later, another text. Mark, you know what? Don't even bother showing up. I'm sick of this. Enjoy whatever little tantrum you're throwing, but when we get back, we're sitting down and talking this out. Then we'll move past it and start our life together. As if I was just waiting for him to come back. Then came Hannah's messages. But not just to me. She started a group chat with me and Mark. I never meant to ruin things. I really hope we can move past this. Mark loves you. Please don't hold this against me. I just want things to go back to the way they were. I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back. Mark was quick to respond. See? She's apologizing. Can you stop acting like a victim now? This is exactly what I mean when I say you overreact. She's trying to make peace, and you're being immature. I stared at the screen, the weight of his words sinking in. He abandoned me at our wedding. He ignored every warning from his friends. He let Hannah manipulate every part of his life and mine. And after all that, he still expected me to apologize. I exited the chat, and I never responded. 2 weeks into our trip, I figured Mark was back home by now. That's when the texts started again. At first, he tried to sound casual. Where are you? Then the calls came. Voicemails I never listened to. Next, the messages turned more insistent. I'm going to your parents' house if you don't answer me. Then came the anger. You think running away makes you the bigger person? Fine. But if you don't come home soon, I'm filing for divorce. I almost laughed. Then, finally, his last message came. You never filed our marriage papers. Silence. For the first time, he understood. We were never married. All that time, he had convinced himself he was still in control, that he could walk away from our wedding and still expect me to wait for him, that he could threaten me with divorce, not realizing I was never his to divorce. I smiled to myself. I never responded. Jamie and I spent the next few months traveling across Thailand. At first, it was about escape, getting as far away from the wreckage of my almost marriage as possible. But somewhere along the way, it became about something more. We arrived in a small village where Jamie's cousin Zach was volunteering as an English teacher. She had mentioned him before, kind, patient, the type of person who never rushed through life. But I hadn't expected to meet him, let alone connect with him the way I did. Jamie had already told him what had happened, how I had nearly walked down the aisle, how Mark had abandoned me, how Hannah had been in the middle of everything. But Zach never pushed me to talk about it. Not once. He never brought it up unless I did. Never looked at me with pity or asked invasive questions. If he was curious, he kept it to himself. Instead, he just let me exist. And that meant more than I could put into words. Zach was different from Mark in every way. Where Mark made me feel like I had to fight for his attention, Zach gave it freely. Where Mark second-guessed me, Zach believed me, in me. He didn't treat me like someone who had been left behind. He treated me like someone who was still whole. At first, I kept my walls up, but Zach never tried to knock them down. He just waited. He made me laugh when I needed to. He made space for me when I wanted to be alone. And when I finally opened up, it was on my own terms. One night, sitting by the river, I told him everything. And he just listened. No interruptions, no unnecessary sympathy, just understanding. Jamie saw it happening before I did. I knew you'd fall for him, she teased one afternoon, nudging me with her shoulder. I didn't, I started, but she just laughed. Please, I've known Zach my whole life. He doesn't let just anyone in, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. That night, Zach turned to me and said, I don't want to say goodbye when you leave. My heart skipped. And for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. When our year in Thailand ended, Jamie, Zach, and I flew home. My parents were waiting at the airport, and from the second they met Zach, they loved him. Just my mother pulled him into a hug. My father shook his hand, already treating him like family. And Zach? He hit it off with my dad immediately, something Mark had never been able to do. They started talking about work, sports, and travel, and by the time we got home, my dad was already inviting him to go fishing that weekend. Mark had always been awkward around my family, never quite knowing how to connect. But Zach? It was effortless. And just like that, he fit into my life seamlessly. A month later, he proposed, and we were preparing for our wedding. But all the while, Mark wasn't done. Even though I had ignored him for months, he still tried to reach me. Calls, voicemails, texts. At first, they were neutral, just simple messages asking me to talk. Then they turned frustrated. I don't know why you're ignoring me, but we need to talk. Then, angry. This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. You need to stop running from this. And then desperate. Do you really think you'll be happy without me? I never responded. One afternoon, Jamie was scrolling on her phone when she suddenly snorted in disbelief. What? I asked. She turned her phone toward me. It was Hannah's social media page filled with pictures of her and Mark. Laughing at a restaurant, out at an event, a cozy selfie captioned, "Some people just belong together." I rolled my eyes and handed Jamie her phone back. "She's trying to get a reaction out of you," Jamie said, disgusted. "Don't give her one." I smiled. I wasn't planning to. It was a cool autumn afternoon when Zach and I went to a local park for our engagement photo shoot. The trees were painted in hues of red and gold, the perfect backdrop for the occasion. Jamie, of course, was there, hyping us up from the sidelines. Zach pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine as the photographer directed us. "Hold her like you never want to let go," she instructed. Zach chuckled. "That's easy." The moment was perfect, until we heard her voice. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" I didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. Hannah stood a few feet away, her arms loosely linked with some guy I didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a tailored blazer and dark jeans, his expression one of mild disinterest, like he wasn't quite sure why he was here. His sharp features gave him an air of importance, and from the way Hannah was clinging to him, it was clear she wanted everyone to believe he was someone worth noticing. But despite the man standing next to her, her attention was entirely on me and Zach. I could see the way her eyes flickered between us, the way they lingered a little too long on Zach. There it was, that barely concealed glint of jealousy. She tilted her head. "I didn't know you were engaged again." Noticing my engagement ring, Jamie crossed her arms. "Why would she tell you?" Hannah ignored her, keeping her gaze locked on Zach. "And you must be the new guy." Zach, always calm, always composed, simply smiled. "Zach," he introduced himself, his arm securely around my waist. "And you are?" Jamie snorted. "Not important." Hannah's jaw clenched slightly, but she quickly forced out a laugh. "Well, I just think it's so interesting that you moved on so fast." She gave a fake pout. "Mark must be heartbroken," I smirked. "I wouldn't know. I don't talk to him." For a second, something flickered in Hannah's expression. She was trying to hide it, but I saw it. That hint of frustration, that look of someone losing control of a game they thought they were winning. Before she could say anything else, her mystery man cleared his throat. "Hey, I thought we were getting dinner?" he said, shifting uncomfortably. For a second, Hannah hesitated. Then, just like that, she plastered on a sweet smile, slipping her arm back through his. "Of course, let's go." As they walked away, Jamie muttered under her breath, "Who even was that guy?" I glanced after them, watching as Hannah leaned into him, whispering something with that same calculated sweetness she always used on Mark. But the guy barely reacted. "Someone she's trying to sink her claws into," I said. "She needs a new game." Jamie rolled her eyes. "Good luck to him." Zach turned to me, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "You okay?" I smiled up at him. "More than okay." Then we went right back to our photo shoot, like she was never even there. A couple of days later, we were invited to join our group of friends and mutual friends to the bowling alley, something we used to do often. It had been a while since I attended a gathering like this, casual, familiar, yet laced with old tensions. I was hesitant at first, but Jamie convinced me. "It'll be fun," she had said. "Besides, you need to show your face sometime." I agreed. What I didn't expect was for Mark and Hannah to show up. They arrived late, walking in together as if nothing had changed. Hannah was smiling too widely, her eyes scanning the room, until she saw me. For a split second, her expression faltered. Then, just as quickly, she recovered, looping her arm through Mark's like they were the perfect pair. Jamie nudged me. She's up to something, I sighed. She's always up to something. I ignored them for the most part, choosing to focus on the game. Zach sat beside me, his easygoing energy making it easier to pretend Mark and Hannah weren't there. We took turns bowling, cheering when someone got a strike, groaning when the ball veered into the gutter. The atmosphere was light, at least for a while. But then, I started hearing it. Hannah's voice, just a little too loud, carrying over the crashing of pins. I just feel so bad. I never meant for things to turn out this way. I didn't look up, but I knew she was talking about me. Jamie shot me a look. I miss how things used to be, Hannah continued, her tone dripping with false regret. I just wish she would forgive me. Jamie clenched her teeth. She's baiting you. I knew. I wasn't going to give her the reaction she wanted. But then, just as Mark got up to grab drinks from the concession stand, Hannah took her chance. She turned to me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I just don't understand why you won't forgive me, she murmured, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. The group quieted. Eyes darted between us. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Mark returned. He saw Hannah's devastated expression, then looked at me. His face hardened. Are you seriously still holding on to this? He snapped. She's been trying to make things right, but you refuse to move on. It's exhausting. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. Zach, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke up. She seems to have moved on perfectly fine. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. Mark turned his glare to Zach, sizing him up. And you are? Zach leaned back against the ball return, completely unfazed. Her fiancé. The room fell silent. Mark's expression froze. Oh, he said after a moment, his voice tight. You're engaged? I lifted my hand slightly, showing my ring. Yeah, I am. Hannah's fingers twitched against her lap, but she kept her face carefully neutral. Mark swallowed. His gaze darted between me and Zach like he was trying to process it. I could see it, the way the reality of it was finally sinking in. And then Hannah blinked. That calculating glint returned to her eyes. She was plotting, waiting for the perfect moment. When a new game started, we all split into two teams. Mark and I ended up on the same team, while Zach and Hannah were on the other. Jamie gave me a knowing look, but I shrugged. I wasn't going to let this ruin my night. Mark, however, had other plans. As we waited for our turns, he leaned in. We need to talk, he muttered. I kept my eyes on the bowling lane. We don't. Mark exhaled sharply. You're being petty. You know that, right? I turned to face him, arms crossed. Oh, do tell. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You keep acting like I cheated on you. Hannah and I never did anything. I scoffed. You left me at the altar for her. I left because she needed me. His voice dropped lower, like he actually thought that would make it sound reasonable. She was going through something, and you overreacted. We're basically married. You can't just walk away over this. I laughed. We're not married, Mark. You know that. His jaw tensed. That's why you started texting me again, isn't it? I continued. Because it finally hit you that I never filed the papers. We were never legally married, and now you think you can convince me to come back. Mark didn't deny it. Instead, he grabbed his bowling ball and threw it down the lane. Gutter ball. I didn't bother holding back my smirk. Meanwhile, across the room, Hannah was doing what she did best, manipulating. She leaned in close to Zach, her voice low. I just worry about you. I know you're new to all of this, but she's complicated. Zach didn't react. She has a temper, Hannah continued, feigning reluctance. I know you've seen it. Zach finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. You mean the same temper that got her to walk away from someone who treated her like an afterthought? Hannah blinked. I'm just saying, you should be careful. Zach smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Funny. That's exactly what Jamie told me about you. Hannah's face twitched with irritation. I walked back toward Zach just in time to see it. She wasn't getting the reaction she wanted, and she hated it. As the night went on, I could hear Hannah gossiping about me to a small group of our mutual friends near the snack counter. She just left, she whispered, voice dripping with feigned concern. Didn't even try to work things out with Mark. It's like she never really cared about him at all. One of the girls hummed in response. I thought they already signed the papers. They did, Hannah sighed dramatically. She just threw it all away. Poor Mark. I clenched my jaw, turning my focus back to the game. Jamie nudged me, clearly having heard the same thing. She's pathetic. She's desperate, I muttered. From the corner of my eye, Hannah glanced over to see if I was listening. When she noticed I wasn't reacting, she upped the dramatics. She has a habit of running when things get tough, she continued. Zach will see that soon enough. That did it. Before I could turn to respond, Zach beat me to it. Loud enough for the group to hear, he casually said, I don't think someone who walked away from a toxic relationship is the problem. Sounds more like she finally had enough. The conversation behind us fell silent. Hannah's face twitched as she forced a laugh. I was just saying, You always are, Zach interrupted, flashing a charming yet pointed smile before grabbing my hand. Come on, love, it's your turn. Hannah watched, seething, and I had never been more satisfied. Later in the night, after I had stepped away from the group to grab a drink, Hannah found her moment. She slid up beside me, voice quiet and sweet. Can we talk? I didn't bother looking at her. We have nothing to talk about, she sighed, playing the role of the wounded friend. I just wanted to apologize. I never meant for things to go this way. I scoffed, finally turning to her. You never meant to ruin my wedding? You never meant to have Mark walk out on me? Or you never meant to get caught? She blinked, feigning hurt. You don't understand. No, Hannah, I do understand. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. You wanted Mark, and you got him, so why are you still trying to ruin me? Hannah's innocent expression flickered for a split second, but she quickly composed herself. You didn't just want Mark, I cut in, watching as she tensed. You wanted to make sure that whoever stole him from you suffered. A bitter silence passed between us. Then, just as expected, she played her final card. She gasped dramatically, stumbling back like I had shoved her. You pushed me, she cried. Mark appeared immediately, his face twisted in frustration. Seriously? Can you not do this for once? I barely had time to react before he started lecturing me, his voice filled with exhaustion. You never grew up, he said, shaking his head. You're always playing the victim, always running away when things don't go your way. I clenched my fists. You walked out on me, Mark, and you're still bitter about it. Before I could respond, Zach stepped in. She didn't push her, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned to Hannah, unimpressed. You really need new material. Hannah's lips parted, her eyes darting between us, looking for a way out. But Zach wasn't done. You've been pulling this same act for years, haven't you? He tilted his head, stepping between Mark and me protectively. But see, the problem is, you're not dealing with Mark anymore. You're dealing with me. Hannah fell silent, her face burning red. A hush fell over the bowling alley. People had noticed. Whispers rippled through our group as friends exchanged looks, murmuring among themselves. Did she really just fake that? She's done this before, hasn't she? No way. Was she actually the reason he left his wedding? Hannah heard them. I could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the slight twitch in her fingers. She knew people were catching on. Mark, on the other hand, looked shaken. His eyes darted between Hannah and me, then to the people whispering around us. For the first time, real doubt flickered across his face. You've been pulling this same act for years, haven't you? Zach's voice cut through the noise. Hannah stiffened, her mask cracking. More whispers, more people putting the pieces together. And Mark? For once, he hesitated. I could see the thoughts racing through his head, the weight of the past finally catching up to him. How many times had Hannah conveniently needed him? How many times had she cried, making me the villain? How many times had he blindly chosen her over me, over everything? He looked at Hannah again, his expression unreadable. And for the first time since all of this started, she didn't meet his gaze. Mark's face was tight with something unreadable, anger, regret, maybe even shame. He looked at me one last time, but I didn't give him the reaction he was looking for. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. The bowling alley felt unnervingly quiet as he strode toward the doors. The weight of everything, the years of manipulation, the blind devotion, the cracks in his trust for Hannah, it was all finally crashing down on him. Hannah's eyes darted between Mark's retreating figure and me. For a moment, I saw panic flash across her face. Then, like clockwork, she put on her performance. Mark, wait, she gasped, stumbling after him. Please, let's just talk about this. She ran after him, her voice frantic, as if she was losing control of the one thing that always worked in her favor, his loyalty. Everyone watched them leave, the tension lingering in the air even after the doors swung shut behind them. Jamie exhaled, shaking her head. Well, that was a long time coming. Zach wrapped an arm around my shoulder. You okay? I let out a slow breath and nodded. Yeah, I think I am. And for the first time in a long time, I really meant it. We didn't hear a peep from either Mark or Hannah after that, and finally anticipated day arrived. The day was warm, the sun casting a golden glow over the venue. Not a church, no aisles, no forced smiles, no ghosts of the past. Instead, Zach and I chose something simple. An intimate outdoor wedding, surrounded by the people who mattered. Jamie stood by my side as my maid of honor, beaming like she had been waiting for this day just as much as I had. My parents were there, looking at Zach with a warmth they had never shown to Mark. Because Zach fit in, he never had to try. The ceremony was short, but every moment was meaningful. When it was time for vows, Zach took my hands in his eyes steady and sure. I never believed in fate, he admitted, but then I met you. I smiled through my tears. You never forced me to move on, Zach. You just made it easy to. When the officiant finally declared us husband and wife, Zach didn't hesitate. He pulled me in like he had been waiting his whole life to kiss me. The guests cheered, Jamie whooped loudly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing but happiness. After the reception, we climbed into our car, laughing as we drove off, tin cans rattling behind us. But as we rounded the corner, my laughter faded. Mark was standing there. He wasn't dressed for a wedding, wasn't smiling or waving, just standing, watching. For a second, our eyes met, and then we were gone. When Zach and I returned from our honeymoon, Jamie wasted no time filling us in on what had happened while we were gone. Mark lost his job, she said over dinner. He's been staying with a friend. He basically lost it once he realized how she messed up his life. I barely reacted. What about Hannah? Zach asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. Jamie smirked. Oh, she left. Went running back to her ex-husband. I raised a brow. Didn't he move on? Jamie nodded, grinning. Yep, he's dating someone new. Zach chuckled. Karma works fast. I didn't say anything, just took a sip of my drink. It wasn't my problem anymore. Hannah had spent years ruining people's lives. Mark had spent years defending her, and now she was alone. And Mark was finally paying the price for the choices he had made. I looked at Zach, at the man who had given me a new beginning. I had no regrets. I never looked back.